Hello everyone, and happy Halloween. You know what scares me? Failed products and things with too many eyes. And there aren't many better combinations of the two than this. The Light L16, a 16-lens camera, crowdfunded, raised $35 million, released very late in 2017, reviews started coming out in 2018, launch price of $2,000, but after its failure, they're now going for $120, brand new, never opened, in their box on eBay. So, today is a look at the Light L16 camera. Bit of a special episode because I don't usually cover things like this, but I could not resist the allure of this bizarre little device. We'll go ahead and hold down the power button to boot it up while I get into the background a little bit. Following 2 years of development and raising money, the Light L16 was released in December of 2017, as I mentioned. Now, the camera features 16 lenses, and that is what makes it exceptionally unique. Now, the Light L16 claimed to use computational photography to achieve DSLR quality in a clearly smaller package. And there we go, it's just booted up. DSLR quality photos in a much smaller package. And, well, it surely does achieve the smaller package, and it packs all 16 of these sensors in almost a haphazard fashion. Well, it certainly does achieve the smaller package. This is about the size of a modern smartphone, although it's 2 or 3 times the thickness of one. It's actually not too far off from the size and weight of a 3.5-inch hard drive would be. So as far as point-and-shoot cameras go, or smartphones, both of which you would carry around to take pictures, it's in that league. It's pretty compact, pretty small. But of course, what stands out from smartphones and point-and-shoot cameras are its rather haphazardly placed array of 16 lenses, all with their own sensor. Now, it has 3 native focal lengths: mid-range, 70mm, wide-angle, 28mm, and 150mm telephoto. There are 5 28mm lenses, 5 70mm lenses, and 6 150mm telephoto lenses. Now, another way this camera pretty significantly differs from smartphones is that the optics are actually motorized. So, the 28mm is completely fixed. There's no motor on its mirror, but all of the 150 and 70mm lenses actually move around, and it's kind of terrifying watching them wiggle and jiggle. Look at them go. They're having such a nice little time in there. And that is because the Light L16, in addition to computational photography, creates its images through folded optics, and the name is exactly as implied. In your normal camera, you look right down the lens and you see the sensor. It's right there. That's your sensor right at the end of the lens. But in the L16, the way they reduced the space is by a mirror at 90 degrees to reflect light into the optics, which are placed horizontally. So the sensors are actually like this instead of like this. And light is reflected onto the sensors through this folded optic system. So all of the lenses and mirrors and sensors are laying down flat so that the device can be so thin. So that means, you know, you look at a picture of a modern smartphone with the back taken off, and like 78% of it is battery, and 18% of the remaining is the camera. That is not what the L16 is like. All of this in the guts is just optics. The actual PCB is gonna be only a very small portion of the device. Now, I'm not going to risk actually disassembling this because it seems difficult to do, but its build is absolutely fascinating. So it features those three focal lengths, 28, 70, and 150. But of course, you're going to want something in between at some point. So that's when the computational photography comes in. Well, there's no better way to show you how this works than to try it out really quickly. So let's do exactly that. So of course, as I mentioned, the camera features three native focal lengths, 28, 70, and 150. But inevitably, you're going to desire something in the middle. Now, how does this work? Well, each sensor is 52 megapixels. And notice what happens here when I zoom from 69 to 70 millimeters. See that wobble or flash of the screen? That's because it's actually switching from the 28 to the 70 millimeter lens. It is physically switching to the appropriate sensor. So, it captures images from up to 10 sensors at once to form an image at those intermediate focal lengths, such as, say, 35 or 100 millimeters that don't fall within the native focal length of one of those sensors. So yes, the L16 uses digital zoom. However, the Light L16's digital zoom works in a far different manner from any other camera I've ever used or ever will use, because nothing like this will ever be made ever again in my lifetime. This doesn't take pictures. What it does is it dumps raw data from up to 10 sensors at once, as mentioned, and then it processes that into a photo. Through computational photography, it actually blends the images from up to 10 sensors at once to create your final image. So, it's not some sort of AI image enhancement that didn't exist in 2017. That wasn't a thing when the L16 released. That might be what we would expect today, but the way the L16 does it is, well, it's a lot better. It just stitches together a ton of images and makes one whole picture. Now, I'm going to show you some examples of this working very well and some examples of it working very poorly in a bit. But let's talk a bit more about the hardware. Let's put it on the desk and give it a little look. An extremely important part of every camera is its hardware. That's why my go-to in 2024 is the 2004 HP PhotoSmart 945, because I have never found another camera that has the same features. And that goes to show just how big of a part a camera's hardware plays in a photographer's preference. So how does the L16 stack up? Well, you'll notice there are no manual controls, save for the shutter button and the power button. Now, it seems as though there was an intention to have a telephoto and wide button, a physical rocker, or some sort of capacitive touch sensor for adjusting the zoom level. Because why else would there be this cutout in the case with this notch in the middle? The plastic here is completely bare, it's not stamped with anything, and there's nothing under it. It does nothing when you press it, so there's nothing there. So that was an intended feature at some point. That's not the only unused feature on the camera, though. The dock port is another. There was no dock accessory ever released. The bottom also features the single USB-C port, an audio in and out jack, a standard tripod mount, and the side features hook for a wrist strap. And that is it. There's nothing else on the L16. That's all. The entire unit is very minimalist, all built from reflective glass, aluminum, and a crap ton of sensors. And again, they all wiggle and jiggle around. So what is it like to use? Well, I've upgraded my unit from the OS version it came with, which was the stock factory operating system version, to the latest one. And you'll want to do that if you want video capability. From the factory, the Light L16 was not capable of video. It also crashed more on the factory operating system, which is the primary reason I upgraded it. But another nice feature added in later builds is the ability to run APKs, third-party apps. I'll talk about that in a bit. But first of all, let's just get around to some ergonomic discussion. I have the camera in ISO mode right now because I want to show you something that bothers me. The camera stops scrolling when you reach the bottom of the screen. So to adjust the ISO, you have to place and raise your finger multiple times. You can't hold the ISO button and adjust with the other finger. There's no way to, say, drag to the side to adjust the scrolling speed. You have to place and raise your finger multiple times. And that's just one example of something that slightly irks me. But in a camera that has absolutely no manual controls whatsoever, unfortunately, your on-screen controls really matter. And when all of your on-screen controls are structured in the same way, a hold down and scroll with one finger menu, this problem becomes pretty annoying pretty quickly. Speaking of hold down and scroll, you have 4 modes on the factory version, or an extra video mode on the latest OS version. Auto, which is exactly what you would expect. ISO priority, where you set your ISO. Shutter priority, where you shut your shutter speed. And manual, where you change everything. Now, auto tends to work fine, and that's because a big selling point of the Light L16 is that you can change everything in post. Because again, this doesn't take pictures. It dumps raw data. And that is why on an almost completely blank 256 gigabyte device, I have only 1248 photos remaining on card. And I say on card as if, well, you know, because I'm used to cards. You can't change the card out. There's no SD slot, there's no compact flash slot, there's nowhere you can open up and put storage in, and that bothers me. But anyway, back to my main point, 1248 on a 256 gigabyte device, and that's because each photo is a raw data dump of about 160 to 180 megabytes. Now, of course, some things you cannot compensate for in post. Primarily, grainy photos from too low of an ISO or too fast of a shutter speed. So you can't compensate for those in post. But let's say you want more background blur to simulate a lower f-stop value. You can change that in the Light Lumen software. And let me demonstrate that really quickly for you. Alright, well, I've taken a couple photos. And this is not a good photo, of course. This is just for demonstration purposes. So this is shot at 69 millimeters, ISO 480, clearly. Now, first of all, we're going to hit this button, which will take it from a preview to a good quality photo. And you just saw that significant increase in quality. That is because a good quality photo uses... Well, I'm glad I caught that live. That happens a lot, actually. A good quality photo uses 5 cameras to stitch together its image. The preview is only 1. But if you export your photo to PC, it will use up to 10 when you render out your photo. Now, the editing process on the camera is a little bit slow, I think, as you can see. However, it is incredible that these features are just here, and you can change all of this on the camera. Let's say, for example, I want more background blur. Perfect. The L16 records the depth at which objects are in your photo. Here's the depth map that it's calculated. Now, that depth map is what it uses to process post-processed f-stop effects. Let's set it down to 4, down from 15, and see what happens. And there we go. That is some good, natural-looking background blur. And I'll put the original and the new one side by side on screen for you. You can also set your focus to a specific object on the camera, which is absolutely incredible that this is a thing that exists. Now, what would be really nice is if in the gallery you could make a copy of an image, so you could directly see the side-by-side comparison of original versus your altered version. Very sadly, you cannot do that. Now, that brings me a little bit to my next point. Speaking of comparisons, here is a photo shot at 69 millimeters. Here is a photo shot at 70. Even through the lens of another camera, you can see there is a clear color difference between these two images. And that is a massive problem with the Light L16. When zooming between focal lengths, there is a clear difference in the colors portrayed by the lenses. Now, the lens used for the preview is, of course, not fully reflective of what your final image will look like. However, it is fully reflective of what the final image will look like in the case of these colors, which are different. There is a bit of a shake in the screen because the lenses are in physically different positions. That's because the 28mm lens used for preview is physically lower on the chassis than the 70mm lens used for preview, creating, in effect, this kind of jarring switch between the two. And of course the same is true when you go all the way up to 150, which takes ages. So there we go, there's 150. I'm down to 13 megapixels because I've zoomed in so far, but the quality still looks just fine, even in just a single camera preview. And that's some pretty close focus for a 150mm telephoto. That was about 1.5 feet. So that's another advantage. You can zoom in super close and still get ridiculously good looking images that are only grainy if you pinch and zoom in even more, and that is another advantage of the L16's folded optics. You can use 150mm telephoto from 1 foot away. But back to this idea of these two pictures looking different. This one is yellower, this one is bluer. And even when you process the photo, that difference in color persists. And you can't get rid of it in post either. No matter how much editing you do, the two cameras will still look a tiny bit different. Now, that is not a problem if you're just taking photos. However, it's a problem with video. And I'm about to show you a couple things that are a problem with video. So let's start at 48mm. As you begin to zoom towards 70, the color changes. And of course, the lens changes as well. Now, I of course showed you that you could adjust the depth, the f-stop, the crashing of the program. There are a lot of things that you can adjust when it comes to photos. Depth, perceived f-stop, and of course your typical photo things that most cameras would let you adjust, like your exposure. Now you have to select it and then drag up or down on the side, and unfortunately it takes a little while to process. But you can adjust your temperature of color, your tint, how blue or yellow it is, how vibrant your photo is, how saturated. Of course, those typical things. I can really bring out the yellow in my clock's plastic, for example. Of course, you can do cropping, and you can save your adjustments as a preset, which will apply once you load it, or after processing, whichever you choose. Now look at all that wonderful editing we can do for photos. I wonder what we can do for videos. Nothing. The button isn't there. You cannot edit videos on the Light L16 camera. You can't change their color. You can't change their saturation or vibrance or hue. You can't even trim it down to a smaller length. You can't do anything. You can't process the videos either. Video is always a one sensor ordeal from the Light L16 camera, which is really unfortunate that video isn't able to utilize the incredible capabilities of the camera. In fact, I'm going to show you a couple videos shot on it later because it's a bit of a shame, actually. Yeah, this just runs Android, by the way. This is Android 6.0. So because it just runs Android 6, you can put apps on it and run other software. Another tragic thing about the L16's proprietary camera is that a third-party camera app, like, say, Instagram's camera, is entirely incapable of utilizing it. It needs a special driver, if you will. The operating system doesn't know what to make of it, and therefore, neither does any program. Now, let's say I want to put this picture of the clock on my Instagram story. I can do that. Of course I can, because I already took the picture and it is a JPEG on the flash storage now. So yes, that's possible, but you can't actually take pictures with any third-party camera app that I've tried using the L16. Now, speaking of apps, there are a couple things that the Light L16 cannot do without the companion Lumen app on PC. Or Mac, if you're one of them. The Lumen app allows the same editing features which are present on the camera, as well as further processing of images if you want to export them as a ridiculously giant JPEG, a DNG, or that's it, actually. There are only two formats, JPEG and DNG, or digital negative, which is kind of like a RAW file. This Lumen software allows full resolution 52 megapixel processing of up to 10 cameras to export your photos. And you saw how long it took for that 14 megapixel picture with 5 cameras on the L16 itself to process. Even on my copiously powerful workstation here, it'll still take like about 2 minutes per photo if I really do some touch-up and editing on them. And that's not only because it doesn't really use that many CPU cores, but also because the software is kind of sluggish. But let's just give this a shot real quick. Now, here in this library, I have a ton of photos that I've shot on the L16. That's a great one. So, here I have all these pictures that I've shot on the L16. This is a couple hundred. So going through all these photos, ooh, that's a good one. I really like that one. So, of course, just like on the camera, you can adjust your depth and all of your regular, tone, color, that sort of thing. This photo is pretty grainy in the background, actually, and on the flowers themselves. That is not the prettiest photo this camera has ever shot. And that's because it's at 98 millimeters, one of those weird intermediate focal lengths. 6336 by 4752. What's that? How many megapixels? That's 30 megapixels. So not the full 52, that's 10,000 by 7,800. But let's just do some quick depth effect work. Set that to f-stop of 8 and it looks like hot garbage. Now, that is the unfortunate side effect of software adjusted depth on super fine objects when your lenses don't all point at the same thing. These don't all face the same object. And therefore, when you go and try to adjust the depth on something super fine like flowers in post, it gets all blurry and messy because the camera didn't correctly calculate the depth at which the flowers are in the image. Some of the sensors found the depth of the background because they couldn't see the flowers, or the flowers weren't in the center of their image. So this is a really unfortunate byproduct of this multi-sensor idea. And of course, we can pretty much all but completely erase just the tips of the flowers if we set this depth effect all the way up. So we're not going to save that picture. Now we'll try it on a larger flower, and I bet the depth effect will be better here. It's not making much of a difference. The background is already rather blurred. Oh, now it's just blurring the subject. So, unfortunately, and look how coarse those lines around the edges are. Look how blotchy that is. I mean, some of the effects that this software generates, you can find free websites that do background blurring better. And that's really unfortunate, because this camera has some fantastically unique hardware. But sometimes the software completely ruins your image. These 16 sensors could capture something fantastic, but because of the way the software lines it all up, it won't look good. Lens flare is also really interesting on this camera because you get multiple instances of lens flare to deal with. There's up to 10 lenses experiencing flare at a time. Now, you can zoom in on these images as you're seeing, but then it takes time to process the zooming in, which is unfortunate. I understand why, though. That giant resolution would eat a lot of memory if you just zoomed in. But I feel like this software should detect if you have a lot of free memory and take advantage of it. In fact, I think the software actually does use a lot of memory. Yes, 4 gigabytes of RAM currently. And the more photos you add to this software, the slower it gets. Oh, upcoming video leaks here. This is a fun one. I really like this photo. There we go. There's a full 28mm focal length using every single sensor the camera has to offer. 10,000 by 7,800. And that's a pretty good resolution. You can zoom in pretty far and you don't get crust. Now, another area in which this camera doesn't succeed is the classic effect of shoot through another lens. When you don't have one sensor to put that lens up to, this trick gets a lot harder to pull off. You get blurry images that also take quite a long time to process. The computer just can't figure out what to do with this picture. So you get these blurry, grainy images because the L16 and its software can't stitch together the focus properly from 16 sensors when only the preview camera is properly shooting down that lens. So, yeah, I mean, that looks awful, frankly. But I tried a lot of different shots with this camera, clearly. This one actually looks fantastic. I must have done some editing on that. Yes, I changed the color, contrast, and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, due to small sensors being small sensors, you zoom in far enough and you still get this grain on the edges of your objects, regardless of whether or not this used all these sensors, all these 16 sensors, the lowest common denominator is still the issue. And it doesn't matter how many sensors you add, if all of your sensors are just tiny little smartphone cameras that are capturing images that are grainy and a little washed out due to the nature of small sensors. And that is really the problem I have with the L16. The lowest common denominator are the sensors. And those sensors, sure, adding them can create a high-resolution photo. However, when you zoom in, you see that each sensor is producing a grainy image. So it really doesn't matter how high-res your image is if you're stitching together pictures that don't look good. And for a quick comparison of how it stacks up to a DSLR, how well it produces those DSLR quality images. A couple weeks ago, I shot some portraits. Here is the Light L16. Here is this camera. This camera is a Sony NEX VG20 from what, 2012? Yeah, I think it's a 2012 camera. It's from the NEX Alpha line, so it is a half-frame camera. I shot this on a very inexpensive lens. Well, not very inexpensive, but like pretty low priced as far as Sony's lenses go. An 18 to 55 millimeter Sony lens. And it looks so much better than the Light L16. No amount of editing will make this photo better than this one. The Light L16's photos also take a copious amount of time to load because they're like 30 megabytes each. I shot a bunch. There we go. Here's one with foliage. I don't look very enthused. Yeah, here we go. So that foliage looks grainy, it looks blurry, and it looks pretty washed out. You can see that there's uneven blur on this foliage. It's a mess, frankly, in this area. But then there's this defined line right here at which the foliage clears up. That's because one sensor didn't get as good of a picture as another. On a Sony, you don't get that problem. The foliage, sure, it's a little muddy, but the background blur is from the f-stop of the lens, and it's even throughout the entire image because none of it was created after the fact by a software that only knows how to look at part of the image, not the entire picture as a whole. So that's the other problem with the Light L16. Inconsistent images between, oh no, I don't want to shut down. Inconsistent images between sensors. As demonstrated in the video when switching between 69 and 70 millimeters, shot on the 28 and 70 millimeter lens, there is that definite shift in both color hue and the position of the preview lens. And both of those actually affect visibly your final photo as you just saw. We're going to look at a couple more examples of photos that I've edited, processed, and exported in full 52 megapixel resolution. Bad, out of focus, and terrible. Washed out. Washed out. Too blue. So clearly, that's the difference between 28 and 70. And look how huge of a difference that makes in the daylight. And I guess that's 150. There's dog. Dark subjects don't play well with this camera. And that's because it's so many images stitched together. But I used the same photo to make the same point. You zoom in and you get this grain. this grain that is only indicative of a tiny sensor. This grain that you wouldn't get on a big sensor that might produce a lower resolution photo, but each pixel looks 3 times better. Is that a cat? Yes, that's actually an adorable photo. I love this. Not that one. This one is cute. That's really adorable. But again, you zoom in on our furry little friend here, and you get this crust. You can't make out the individual hairs. You know on what you can make out the individual hairs? The 2004 HP PhotoSmart 945. Clearly, our subject is at a closer range here. And clearly, there is grain on the fur, because we are dealing with a CCD sensor. But somehow, it still seems to convey pretty equivalent detail to the Light L16. The Light L16 would have had even poorer lighting here because of the dark subject, the ray of sun over here in the field, and this background that is slightly less dark. It would have struggled, would have blurred this fur unevenly, versus just the kind of gross analog fuzz you get from a CCD sensor. But that about sums it up for the Light L16. It had incredible potential. It tried some amazing things. And frankly, the fact that this worked at all still kind of astounds me. But you saw its problems. You saw the app crashing. You saw how long it took to process photos on the camera, and then you heard me describe how long it took on the workstation. You saw the uneven lighting, the uneven blurring, and the uneven video that result from using multiple sensors. You saw the poor low light performance, and we finally determined that the lowest common denominator, that being the tiny little pinhole cell phone imaging sensors you're using in your camera, is going to produce the same image, no matter how fancy the optics are that you slap on it, no matter how many of those sensors you combine in an array to form a single image, no matter how many thousands of dollars you charge for your actually pretty revolutionary technology, you just can't beat one single really good sensor. If you want something even smaller than this, with manual controls, better video, better pictures, get a little Canon point and shoot from like 10 years ago. I had a little Canon PowerShot for a while until I saw they were going for ludicrous prices on eBay, and then I sold it because I like doing things like that. I like recuperating the costs of ridiculous bullshit I buy for videos, like the Light L16. But that PowerShot SD960, I think it was like a 2008, 2009 camera, took better photos than the Light L16 because it had one sensor that was really good at its job. It didn't try to do any of the software magic because its pictures were already good. So I won't say that the Light L16 was a horrible idea, but it's evident from using it why it failed. And it's evident from using it why you shouldn't buy one. I'm not saying it's all around horrible. Again, it is a fascinating idea, and it's a bit of a fun thing to play with as well. However, for practical use, it is not practical and not very usable. It can't be relied upon to produce consistently good quality images. Every now and then you get a fantastic picture out of it, and every now and then you get a complete stinker. And you can't trust the editing tools to compensate for a poor photo either. So unfortunately, the Light L16 it wasn't ever going to succeed. It was never going to compete with DSLRs, as you saw in my example where I compared this Sony to this Light L16 that's now on the floor. It just doesn't stack up well. But that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. This was an expensive and lengthy one to make. So I really hope you enjoyed it. Do let me know if you'd like, to see anything different on the channel, anything specific on the channel. Let me know what you're looking for, and I'll do my best to serve your requests. But that's it for this one, so thank you everyone so much for watching. Thank you particularly to those who have been supporting me for a while, and I hope you'll come back next time and watch a couple more.